Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Congressman Adam Schiff to discuss Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could, published by our friends at Random House. Adam Schiff is the United States Representative for California's 28th Congressional District. In his role as chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Schiff led the first impeachment of Donald J. Trump. Before he served in Congress, he worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles and as a California state senator. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Valerie Jarrett, the president of the Barack Obama Foundation and a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. She served as the senior advisor to U.S. President Barack Obama and assistant to the president for public engagement and intergovernmental affairs from 2009 to 2017. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Finding My Voice, My Journey to the West Wing and the Path Forward, published in April of 2019. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to post your questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Midnight in Washington from Books and Books below. This is essential reading, folks, and we're thrilled to have the book on our shelves. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual screen stage. Here we go. Hello, welcome.
Thank you so much, Christina. Good evening, everyone. I am just delighted to be here with you for the Books and Books virtual book tour. And it is such an honor to be having a chance to moderate the conversation with Chairman Adam Schiff. And I want to begin, Mr. Chairman, by saying thank you for your service. It is never easy to be in public service at any level of government, but you've chosen a particularly challenging time and you fought mightily to protect the very foundation of our democracy. And so for that, I hope everyone who's tuning in tonight is forever grateful. So welcome to the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for your own extraordinary service to the country for many years by the side of President Barack Obama, but also in your work in the private sector and the public sector. We're very much in your debt. Chose a bad time to lose my voice. But also thank you to Books and Books for being our host tonight and for providing such great programming, but also reading material for your customers for so many years. Really a pleasure to be with you as well.
So Midnight in Washington is a metaphor for the theme of your book. And I'm curious about why you decided to write it now. And big picture, what's the takeaway that you hope that your readers gather from the book?
Well, throughout the course of the last several years, my colleagues would come up to me on the House floor repeatedly and say, I hope you're writing this down. You better be writing this down. And I would always respond by saying, when do I possibly have time to write any of this down? But then, like so many Americans during the pandemic, I found myself confined to quarters for a very long period of time. And I thought if I'm ever going to write it down, this is the time to do it when the events are still fresh, but not so fresh that I don't have at least some perspective on them at the time of writing. So I sat down to write about really the fragile state of our democracy. For our generation, I think we grew up at a time when there was a expectation bordering on certainty that every year more countries would be living with democratic forms of government. There'd be more free speech and freedom to associate, the freedom to love whom people would love, that those freedoms were on an inexorable path towards increasing opportunity. But we find ourselves now at a time when the autocrats have been on the rise, when democracy is very much in doubt, when China is going around the world touting its model as a model that can deliver prosperity, but also deliver law and order. And here at home, We're at a time where democracy is being tested like never before. So I wanted to sound the alarm, but also give people optimism about the future, because I'm confident we will get through this. And so I chose that title because midnight may be the darkest hour of every day everywhere in the world, but it's also a time of hope, because what follows holds the prospect of light.
So there are so many amazing stories, and we're going to get to all of those in a minute. You give such a unique behind-the-scenes perspective on this rather critical time in our nation's history. But before we get to that, I want to begin, as my grandmother would say, with who are your people? Like, what your roots? And because I think we're all shaped by our families, and you have your story of your parents and your grandparents. It's kind of the quintessential American story. So I was hoping you would share a little bit about them before we begin into the book.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm the grandson and great-grandson of Eastern European immigrants. My mother's side of the family came from Poland, Russia. My father's side of the family came from Lithuania. And my grandfather was an immigrant. He and his siblings lived in London after immigrating from Lithuania, and then moved to Boston. And so I grew up in Boston as a small child. My mother's side of the family were all Republicans. I have a wonderful photograph on my wall in Washington of my mother's father, who was a delegate to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he's standing with Eisenhower and Henry Cabot Lodge. My father's side of the family, on the other hand, were from a long line of Democrats, Roosevelt, New Deal Democrats. But it was never acrimonious in our house. My brother grew up in the Republican side of the family. I grew up in the Democratic side of the family. But our parents raised us to believe that neither party had a monopoly on good judgment all the time, and that we needed to treat other ideas with respect and have a civil dialogue about them. And so that was really how I was raised, with a strong belief that it's important to give back to the next generation, that we all stand upon the shoulders of those that went before, but also the understanding that we're a big, diverse, beautiful country with a lot of diverse points of view, and we ought to treat each other with respect.
A good foundation that we would hope that many of your colleagues would share at every level of government. You had a couple of experiences early in your career, which in retrospect, I bet you would say shaped your perspective as chairman of the intelligence community. And I think as we all travel through life, we have these experiences, and some successes, some setbacks, some failures, rejection, just everything that shapes us to who we are. But when you look back, there were two in particular I hope that you would share with the audience. And the first was when you successfully prosecuted an FBI spy who was selling government information in exchange for sex and money. And then you also lived in the post-Soviet bloc for a while. So those two experiences in particular, I think, probably shaped your perspective. But tell us a little bit about both.
They really did. And of course, when you're living those experiences in your youth, you don't necessarily believe that they're going to be relevant to what you see later in life. But those two experiences proved to be, very, very much a foreshadow of things to come. The first, when I was a young prosecutor, I was given responsibility to prosecute a case involving the first FBI agent, Richard Miller, ever charged with espionage. He was seduced by a Soviet KGB asset, a woman named Svetlana Ogorodnikova. For some reason, they always seem to be named Svetlana. And Miller was a prime target for the Soviets. He was a philanderer. He was consumed with greed, and he was quite an easy mark. And I learned a lot about Russian tradecraft in prosecuting that case, how the Russians will ensnare people, how they will look for their vulnerabilities and weaknesses, how they will seek to have someone do something smallish and maybe a violation of FBI policy, but not a firing offense, and then escalated to ask them to do something more that if they were caught would get them fired, and then something more that if they were caught would get them jailed, culminating in a request for the FBI's counterintelligence plans, basically how the FBI intended to protect the country from Soviet spies operating in the United States. And I wouldn't know it at the time, but those elements of Russian tradecraft, how they could look to manipulate people based on their hunger for money or based on their immorality. I never would have imagined that I would see that tradecraft at work when it came to the president of the United States. But Donald Trump made a very easy mark, not just for Russian intelligence, but for Vladimir Putin. The other experience I had was living in Eastern Europe, living in what was at the time Czechoslovakia. When I arrived in early 1992, there was little expectation that the country would split. But I watched this xenophobic populist named Vladimir Mečiar appeal to people's baser instincts, blame their economic woes on others, blame it on the Czechs, or blame it on the Hungarian-speaking population, or blame it on the Romani population. And within a matter of weeks, he had so rent the country that it would divide while I was there. And I saw the power of that ugly nativism. And once again, many decades later, when I would see that brand of xenophobic populism in the United States being used to tear us apart again, it was a very familiar echo of the past.
Well, speaking of which, you begin your book with the insurrection on January 6th. And I, together with, I'm sure, every single person tuning in this evening, was appalled as we watched the television that day to see what happened on our nation's capital. But you were there. You were inside the building when it happened. Give us a little bit of a perspective of what it was like for you and your colleagues with whom you had no idea how that day would turn out, and your family, who obviously also had no idea what was going to happen to you. What was that like?
Well, I had suggested to the speaker about 6 months before the election that we form a little rump group of members to try to anticipate everything that could go wrong. What if the Electoral College were tied? What if a state sent 2 slates of electors? What if the vice president didn't do his job and departed from his constitutional duty? We try to anticipate all of the 1,000 things that might happen, except, of course, the one that did, a violent attack on the Capitol. But because I had been involved in the planning for the joint session, I was asked, along with a handful of others, to manage the opposition to the Republican efforts on the floor. So I was there for the whole thing. And in the beginning, I was really not focused on what was happening down the mall. I was paying attention to what I was saying and what the Republicans were saying and how to rebut their arguments. And the first thing I knew that something was wrong, I looked up and the speaker was not in her chair presiding. And I knew that the plan had been for her to preside through the whole session. Before I knew it, 2 Capitol Police rushed onto the House floor and grabbed Steny Hoyer, our number 2, and moved him so quickly off the floor. I remember thinking to myself, I've never seen Steny move that fast. And before I knew it, the police came back on with increasingly dire warnings about what was happening, that there were rioters in the building, that we needed to get out gas masks under our seats, that we needed to be prepared to get down on the ground. And these masks were not like the masks you see police wearing. They were polyethylene bags that you would pull over your head that had an elastic band around the neck to seal it off. And there was a fan to circulate the air, but nonetheless, the idea of pulling a bag over my head was enough to get my heart racing. And pretty soon we could hear the insurrectionists outside the chamber, and they began banging on the doors and breaking windows, and the police said that you need to get out. And even so, I waited. There was a real crush to get off the House floor at this point. And I didn't want to add to the melee at the exit. And a couple of Republicans came up to me and said, "You can't let them see you," meaning the insurrectionists. One of them said, "I know these people. I can talk to these people. I can talk my way through these people. You're in a whole different category." And initially, I have to say, I was kind of touched by their concern over my safety. But that feeling soon gave way to another when I realized that, had they not been lying about the election, had they been not pushing this big lie about fraud, massive fraud, and the election being stolen, I wouldn't need to worry about my safety. None of us would. And in the days that followed, that emotion, that anger with as much the people outside, attacking the police and breaking the doors and windows, but also what I've taken to describe in the insurrectionists in suits and ties, my colleagues on the House floor, who knew it was a big lie and were content to push it. And even after they saw the terrible result, this violent attack, when the attack was put down and we went back to the floor to finish our work that night, they were still at it trying to overturn the election. And to me, that was just unconscionable. The people who attacked the building that day and attacked police that day, they believed the big lie. But the people that I work with inside the chamber knew it was a big lie. And indeed, this was one of the terrible realizations for me over the last 4 years, culminating in January 6th. And that is that the danger to our democracy now comes from within, not predominantly from outside the country, but also that what has put our democracy at such risk is the fact that there were so many people in Congress willing to enable the autocratic ambitions of the former president and unwilling to uphold their oath.
Well, as you said, there were early warning signs for what led to January 6th, which happened a good while ago. And you've obviously been serving in Congress for a while, and there were times, obviously, where you had good relationships across the aisle. And as we get into a conversation, it's going to be a little more political. I do want to say that I'm here in my individual capacity. I'm not representing the Barack Obama Foundation, which is a 501c3. So I just want to be very clear with the audience about the role in which I'm here. But as we delve into this, I wish you would share some of those red flags that you saw early on, and one in particular that surprised me. And at this stage, after 8 years in Washington, I have to say, not too much surprises me, and certainly not after the last or the 4 years of the Trump administration. But if you would share the story about your colleague, Kevin McCarthy, and the conversation that you had on a plane ride, and then how he related that conversation after the plane ride.
I shared this story in the book for a couple of reasons. The first is one of the most frequent things I'm asked by my constituents or others around the country is, what do your Republican colleagues really believe when they talk to you in private? Do they really believe what they're saying publicly? And in the case of Kevin McCarthy, I learned really all I ever needed to know about him 10 years ago on a plane. We were flying back to Washington, D.C. We were seated next to each other on United just by coincidence. And we had the kind of nothing of a conversation that you have when you're waiting for the movie, any movie that is, to start. And we were talking about the midterms that were still 6 months away. I expressed the view that Democrats would win the midterms, and not surprisingly, he took the opposite view. And I thought nothing of the conversation. And then we got to Washington. We went our separate ways. And unbeknownst to me, he went off and did a briefing for the press. And he told the press that night that Republicans were definitely going to win the midterms, and everybody knew it. He sat next to Adam Schiff on the plane, and even Adam Schiff admitted Republicans were going to win the midterms. And I was incredulous. And the next morning, when I learned about this, I rushed up to him on the House floor and I said, Kevin, I would have thought if we're having a private conversation, it was a private conversation. But if it wasn't, you know that I said the exact opposite of what you told the press. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I know, Adam, but you know how it goes.
No, how does it go? Is that how it goes?
Well, you know what I said? I said, no, Kevin, I don't. That's not how it goes for me. You just make, expletive up. That's how you operate, because that's not how I operate. But that is how he operates. And in that respect, Kevin McCarthy was really made for a moment like this, when the leader of his party has no commitment to the truth. Indeed, the leader of his party believes that there is no truth, that he's entitled to his own alternate facts, that truth, as Giuliani said, isn't truth. And I think of all the corrosive things to our democracy over the last several years, this relentless attack on the truth has been among the most debilitating. If we don't have a set of shared experiences from which to decide how we go forward or what direction we go in, democracy doesn't work. And I also wanted to tell that story, frankly, because if there's any chance of him becoming speaker, the American people need to know what that would mean. And what that would mean as a practical matter is the Speaker of the United States would do whatever Donald Trump told him to do. Had Kevin McCarthy been the Speaker in 2020, had we lost a few more seats in the House in that election, he would have overturned the election. And for that reason, he cannot be allowed to go anywhere near that office.
Well, in addition to the truth, our democracy also relies not just on laws, but social norms and behavior that is traditionally what we would expect of people who are in elected office. An expectation that they would work with one another, that they would be on the up and up, and that they would keep the people's business front and center. And so there were a couple of other people and stories I hoped you would tell quickly that kind of you make this point in your book. And one is Devin Nunes, with whom you had a strong working relationship. And then you discover him sneaking up to the White House to meet with the president. That's one. And then the other one is one that point of personal privilege, Mitch McConnell and his behavior around the nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court by President Obama. So share with the audience a little bit of a flavor of those two situations from your perspective.
Well, Devin Nunes and I had worked together extremely well for over a decade prior to the Trump administration. At times when he was the chair of the Intel Committee and times when I was the chair of the Intel Committee. He was not really an ideologue. He was what I would describe as a John Boehner kind of country club Republican. In fact, one of the things that he once said during the Tea Party movement, which I often quoted, was he described the Tea Party as lemmings in suicide vests. So he wasn't an ideologue, but he got to know the former president, Donald Trump, during the Trump campaign. He was asked by Trump to serve on his transition team. I think it was a very heady thing to be, on the phone with the president or incoming president, helping to pick cabinet members. And when it became necessary for our committee to do an investigation into Russian interference in the very election that brought Donald Trump to office, Russian interference that it turned out was directed to help elect Donald Trump, which the Trump campaign welcomed and encouraged, secretly discussed, and then lied about. He was not able to both conduct that investigation impartially and maintain his relationship with Donald Trump. And it blew up in the midnight run, which you've described. When that happened, it brought so much, I think, criticism to Devin Nunes. Even his Republican colleagues did not come to his defense. The only people who did were Trump and Trump World that embraced him. And he's been in that embrace ever since. I take no joy, believe me, in watching that transformation because this was somebody that I was quite friendly with, worked together well with. I will say that even through all of this, we have continued to do the intel business of the country, notwithstanding these vigorous disagreements about the former president. But let me touch on Mitch McConnell because I think what he did in withholding the confirmation of Merrick Garland was a canary in the coal mine. That suddenly, there were no boundaries anymore. Nothing mattered more than holding power. And if it meant denigrating a co-equal branch of government, in this case, the judiciary, as well as the Congress, then he would do it. If it would motivate his base by withholding a justice for a year. There was a similar canary in the coal mine in 2016 when in North Carolina, a Democrat became governor and the Republican legislature, instead of vowing to do better next time or changing its policies to become more popular, decided it would strip the new Democratic governor of his powers. These were signs that something was changing in the Republican Party and in the body politic. But my biggest grievance with Mitch McConnell, frankly, is that after that bloody insurrection, we had the chance to turn the corner as a country. When he saw what a terrible end Donald Trump had brought the country and his own institution, which had sent the vice president and senators fleeing for their lives. You could see Mitch McConnell grappling with whether to cast Donald Trump overboard. And And yet, when the time came and he was asked, well, if he's the nominee, would you support him again? His answer was absolutely. And in that 2-week period between which McConnell went from castigating Trump for inciting the insurrection to telling the public he would absolutely support him again, we lost the chance to move forward. And that's a terrible tragedy for the country.
And now there's revisionist history. This was just a normal day, a tour day, a peaceful demonstration, as though our own eyes couldn't see what actually happened. Another way that we could have avoided January 6th would have been if the Senate had followed your lead after the House impeached President Trump the first time and had convicted him. And you obviously had a complete inside look at that entire process of the investigation, from the early signs, even during the campaign, when there were indications that Russia was trying to influence our election, the firing of Comey. I mean, I could go on and on and on, which led to your investigation. But you and now Speaker Pelosi were hesitant about moving forward with impeachment. Share with us a bit about the process that you went through, that you decided you had to move forward, and what was that trial like?
Well, you can draw a very straight line between Donald Trump's escape of accountability for his Russia misconduct to his engagement in even greater misconduct with respect to Ukraine, and a strong and straight line between his acquittal in the Senate trial for that misconduct and going on to find new and even more egregious ways to try to cheat and ultimately incite an insurrection against our government. The Russia investigation revealed a great many terrible facts about the Trump campaign, including the fact that Donald Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, was secretly meeting with an agent of Russian intelligence and providing that agent of Russian intelligence with internal campaign polling data, while that Kremlin intelligence agency was engaged in a covert social media campaign to elect Donald Trump. But on the day after Bob Mueller testified, and Donald Trump felt he had escaped the jailer for their collusion with Russia, he was back on the phone with, this time, a new country, Ukraine, seeking to coerce Ukraine into helping him cheat in the next election. And by withholding hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine in order to get them to smear his opponent. And in that conduct, you're right. I went from urging us not to move forward with impeachment over his Russian misconduct to believing, particularly when I saw the impact of our failure to hold him accountable, was the very next day being on the phone with yet another world leader trying to cheat again, that the most dangerous thing was not to hold him accountable, even if we couldn't convict. And so we went forward with the impeachment based on his Ukraine misconduct. And of course, during the trial, we made it very clear to senators that if they found him guilty but refused to convict, the odds, I remember saying, were not 5%, not 10, not 50, but 100% that he would try to cheat again, and new in even worse ways. And sadly, that's exactly what we saw. Now, I will say this about the remedy of impeachment. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no flaw in the Constitution. We shouldn't change it to be a majority vote. That's not the problem. The problem is that we don't have enough members of Congress who are willing to give their oath meaning, who are willing to apply ideas of right and wrong and apply the truth. And if we don't, none of it works. There's no draftsman talented enough, not among the founders, not among the present day, not in the entire world, that can constrain us if we're not animated by ideas of right and wrong. And that's what has our country so fragile at the moment.
Well, but there were some heroes, and one of my personal favorites was Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. And when he testified so poignantly, and I was nervous for him in the beginning, because it's hard. I mean, it's really hard to get up there and testify, particularly perhaps for those in the military, when their commander-in-chief is the topic of conversation. And I remember he said at the very end, "Here, right matters." And this was after he described his dad and his family and his commitment to service. What was that moment like for you?
It was so powerful, and you're right. There are a lot of heroes that came out of this chapter of our history, and I liked telling their stories. I thought it was important to tell their stories because for every person who succumbed to the immorality of the former president, there were others who stood up and stood tall. I kept coming back to something the historian Robert Caro once said: that power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it says a lot about who we are. And power revealed Alexander Vindman to be a person of great character. And I remember being really struck with him in a way I wasn't expecting. That is, for this, decorated Iraq veteran who had been injured in combat, there is a real innocence about Alexander Vindman. And what he was asked by my colleague, Sean Patrick Maloney, who's a brilliant lawyer, why it was he felt comfortable telling his father not to worry, even though he was taking on effectively the most powerful man in the world. And he spoke those words here because he said, Congressman, here, this is America, and here right matters. He said it like a prayer. And I found his experience so relatable. I don't think it's a coincidence that Alexander Vindman, Fiona Hill, Marie Yovanovitch, and a lot of the other heroes of this period were immigrants, had an immigrant experience, came from places where Marie Yovanovitch, her parents fled the Nazis and then fled the Soviets. And Alexander Vindman came from Ukraine in search of a better life, his family did. Fiona Hill for opportunities that her father couldn't find as a minor in Britain. And they cling to, as I do, the idea and ideals of America. Those ideas, I think, are what are going to see us through. And so those stories are really important. They're more important to me, I think, than the stories of capitulation are.
Well, I would add to that list of heroes, Adam Schiff. So we're going to get to some questions, but I have one more question for you. You say in your book that you believe the moment we stop being good people, we will stop being a great nation. That truth, right, and decency are important. And that we do not have the luxury of despair, which I love that line. And you seem so optimistic despite these unprecedented times. And I'm an optimist too. I'm always thinking as you're climbing the mountain and it's swerving and curving, but that you're heading to the top. And I have a mom who's 93 and grew up during World War II and the Depression. And she is a pessimist. She says you always have to plan for the worst because sometimes the worst happens. And lately I have reflected on that we're probably both right, that we're both kind of almost at the mountaintop while we're dangling over the precipice, and the direction that we take probably rests with each of us. And in your epilogue, you sum up the moment and you challenge us all. And in your word, you said, we must love our country more than they wish to destroy it. So take a moment to the audience, and particularly to the young people in the audience who are so frustrated with politicians and with government and institutions in general, and they shun them as well as shun each other when they disagree. What would be your challenge to this generation so that when we look back in 17 years, as you say in your book, that history reflects well on the steps that we take going forward?
Well, first I would say we're a tremendously resilient country. We've been through a lot of difficult chapters of our history. And when you're in the midst of a crisis, as we are, it's often difficult to see how you get through it. Sometimes it's difficult to see even if you will get through it, but you do get through it, and we will get through this. And we'll get through this in large part because of that new generation of Americans that are coming of age, and others who have already come of age. The class of 2018, for example, the members who ran for Congress in 2018 are the best new class of members we've ever had. I will put them up against every one of the Watergate babies any day of the week. Many of them have become household names. Many of them came from serving in the military and serving in the State Department and serving in the intelligence community. And in the same way that after 9/11, people joined the service to protect the country. After people saw what Donald Trump was doing to our democracy, they found a new calling by running for office, by being engaged. And we have tremendously benefited from that infusion of new blood in the Congress. And for younger people in particular, they've got the demographic power to really run this country. If they voted in their numbers, if they do vote in their numbers, they could be dictating what we do on climate. If there's not enough in the Build Back Better Act, they have the power to make sure there is in the next bill, if they put that power to work. And so we don't have the luxury of despair. And it's I think a very important point after Tuesday. Tuesday was a rough day for us, but we don't have the luxury of sitting at home and wishing it were otherwise. What is going to get us through this is the fact that there are millions and millions of Americans who love this democracy and cherish our legacy, and will see it through. And I will say this also for people young and old alike who are tuning in today. Don't try to do everything. That way paralysis lies. Don't try to solve every problem. Don't try to think about every problem. Just decide on the one thing you're going to do over the next 16 months to make a difference in the life of your country or your community. Because we can't all be Alexander Vindman's or Marie Yovanovitch's on the global stage, but we can in our own lives. There's opportunity for each and every one of us to make a difference. And what we do right now will determine how quickly we get through this hard time.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Tuesday, because one of the questions in the chat right now says, what is your outlook on 2022 elections next year? And what do you anticipate for 2024? Quote, I feel nervous with what recently happened in Virginia.
Well, first I would say, look, I wish we had won both Virginia and New Jersey. We did win New Jersey. There's a very powerful historic trend that in the president's first term, the party of the president loses both governorships in Virginia and in New Jersey. That was true of George Herbert Walker Bush. It's true of Bill Clinton. It was true of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. So it would have been an aberration if Joe Biden was able to beat the trend. Now, he did beat the trend in New Jersey. So I think we need to put it in some perspective. But there was also a trend historically of the president in power losing seats in the midterms. And we have to be mindful of that too. But that also depends on a different trend that we did not see in the presidential cycle. And that is, normally when someone is swept into office in the first instance, their party, they sweep in with their election many members of the House of the same party. They have a coattail effect. We didn't have that in 2020. Joe Biden didn't have a coattail effect. We lost seats in the House. And in that respect, we already had our correction. We gained a lot of seats in the 2018 midterm, and we lost some of those in 2020. So we've had part of the correction, maybe all of the correction. And I'm convinced that the 2022 election is going to be very close. Whichever party wins won't win by much. And I do think that in a very real sense, democracy is on the ballot, because if the Republicans are successful and in a position in 2024 when Donald Trump is up for re-election, because he will be running again, then Republicans would be in a position potentially to overturn the election were Donald Trump to lose again, as I believe and feel confident he would and he will. So this upcoming midterm is hugely important. And because we've already had that correction, there's reason to go into that midterm optimistic that we can buck the historic trend. It will require us, I think, though, to mount a Stacey Abrams-like effort in every single state in the union.
So we have two comments and one more question, and then I have a question. But if anybody else wants to drop something in, please do. I'll give you the comments first. They're both from the same person. Thank you both for your service to the public. Oh, thank you both, meaning you and me. Thank you, Congressman Schiff, for quoting Congressman Elijah Cummings in your book. We lived through January 6th and the impeachment trial of the former president, but but I'm glad you put it together in a readable book that schools may be able to use in their curriculum in the future. Also, thank you for talking about the history of your family as immigrants. That was heartwarming. Also, he says, I'm a lawyer, and I watched your closing argument on the first impeachment. I thought it was masterful. It also brought tears to my eyes. Parentheses, I'm sorry your root canal was acting up in the middle of it. Just shows you what you have to get through. One other comment was that we're going to get through this because of the older generations too, that remember and will fight right alongside, shoulder to shoulder with the new generations and keep democracy alive. And then somebody wanted to know, how long did it take you to write the book?
It took me about 1.25 years to write the book. And I wasn't expecting it, frankly, to be as dramatic as it was. The most fun part to write, as indeed, Valerie, I know in your own wonderful book, was writing about our upbringing, what sort of made us who we are. Reliving, personally, some of the vignettes was difficult. One in particular I'll share with you. When Bill Barr issued a false summary of the Mueller report, we didn't know that it was a false summary, and he withheld the Mueller report for weeks to sort of let his false summary be baked in. And in the meantime, I was just getting filleted by right-wing media because they were operating on what Bill Barr told the country, which turned out not to be true. Reliving that, and when the summary came out, I was taking my daughter and her boyfriend to a record store in Hollywood, Amoeba Records. And I told them I would meet them inside, and I never made it inside the record store because I was just heart pounding reading this summary on my phone in the car. And in the weeks that followed, until we actually got the report, it felt like I was just twisting in the wind, a human piñata of sorts. So reliving those things wasn't easy, but I do think it's so important to be able to tell this story as a cohesive whole. These things were happening with such rapidity, one abuse after the next, one startling, shocking event after the next. It was like sensory overload for the whole country. And it's important now to step back from it, put things in perspective, and show what picture emerges. And the picture that emerges is one of a deeply flawed, unethical human being who ran our country for 4 years and seemed to come up with new and inventive ways to divide us, and tore down so many of our democratic institutions, so many things that happened that we never could have conceived possible in this country. And we may not have fully appreciated it while it was happening. So I think it's helpful to try to put it in context.
Perhaps, this is my question, perhaps because of how you were raised, as you said, or your experience running for office, not always winning, your ability to be a litigator so effectively, but you always just appear calm and decent. You speak the truth with grace. And that kind of core decency, if you will, must be tough, given what you said, where the right-wing media and the most powerful man in the world, the former president of the United States, were weaponizing everything to come after you. And look, you're a human being. You have a wonderful spouse. You have children. How do you, and I say this not just because I think you explained it well in the book, but I think that what we hope is that more people will want to run for office. And you have to have a tough skin, and you have to realize that it is a noble cause. Nobody said it's an easy cause. But how do you deal with the challenges of all that incoming? And maybe just tell a little bit about what it was like for you having to worry about your son at camp, reading nasty tweets from the president, and get to your daughter before she heard about it, and your wife, who went through her own pain and anguish over watching what was happening to you.
Well, it was certainly difficult on the family, and my son, I think at the time Donald Trump became president, was probably about 13. My daughter was 4 years older, and like a lot of young kids, my son was not as communicative as my daughter, and I didn't always know what he was thinking, and I didn't know how this was all affecting him. both the intense attacks, but also, the equally intense support from people, which can be a burden also, I think, for young kids. The burden it placed on my wife, who is a very strong individual. I remember, in particular, being in the kitchen with her one night, and we were getting a lot of death threats, and they were threats against me, against her, against our children, and that I fully understood, and obviously affected me too. But what I hadn't fully appreciated until we were standing there, I was holding her, tears in her eyes, and she said, "I just can't stand how many millions of people just hate you. They hate you so much." And I never really thought about it from that point of view. I certainly was aware of what a lightning rod I'd become, but I think sometimes it's more difficult for the spouse to deal with that kind of hate. I do have a thick skin, and I credit my parents for raising me in a way that I was comfortable in my own skin. And that allowed me to let certain things roll off my back, but you never let threats to your family roll off your back. What got me through it, frankly, is there were days when I would get up in the morning and I would say to myself, "I just need to get through the day. I just need to get through the day." And at night, and I use this refrain during the impeachment trial, I would say, "I'm still standing," and I would, convince myself I was just going to continue to do that and repeat until the crisis passed. And I hoped and prayed that the crisis would pass in January, and it didn't. And what continues to motivate me is I feel a real sense of mission. I have an opportunity in the position I'm in to make a difference, and I need to use that opportunity. But everybody else has that opportunity too, and you just have to find it.
Well, I will say this to you, Chairman Schiff. We are glad that you are still standing. We hope that you are still standing for decades to come, and that you will continue to serve our country so admirably. We, as we all know, we have always been that beacon of hope around the world. And I think part of why people come to this country is that they're looking for that land where democracy matters, where truth matters, where the rights and privileges that go along with citizenship in this great country all matter. But as you have said so eloquently in the book, it really is up to each of us to fight as mightily as you have in our own way. So sadly, we're at a time. I could have talked to you for another hour or so, and I'm sure the audience could have listened as well. But again, thank you for your service, and thank you for writing this amazing book.
Well, thank you for your incredible service. Thank you for helping to guide President Obama through an incredible administration filled with achievement, and one that made me enormously proud. And thank you for moderating tonight. Such a pleasure to be with you.
And it is an honor and a privilege to have hosted both of you. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores like Books and Books. I think I know the one thing that I'm going to do. It's to put this book in the hands of as many people as I can. That is going to be my contribution. So thank you again for joining us. To everyone watching, have a great evening, and keep reading. And congratulations on this great book.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.